Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into something you might not have heard of before, but it's something I guarantee you've experienced. We're going deep on sludge.
Ah, sludge.
Yeah. Ever get that feeling of just being bogged down by paperwork? Or endless forms, confusing processes?
Oh, tell me about it.
That's sludge in action, my friends.
It is. It's fascinating, right? Even just the word, like the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a thick, soft, wet mud.
Yeah.
And that really captures the feeling of being like stuck, slowed down.
Totally.
But it's more than just a word. It's a framework for understanding these frustrating obstacles we encounter all the time.
Exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is going to be the book, also called Sludge. And we are going to use it to try to uncover all the surprising places you find sludge, the real-world impact, and how we can fight back. You ready to get a little dirty?
Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
All right, so to understand why sludge really matters, I want you to imagine just missing out on a college scholarship because the application was too complex, right? Or waiting like hours in line to vote, potentially discouraging people from participating in democracy.
Yeah.
Or just like struggling with a confusing website for healthcare benefits, and then you just kind of give up. You abandon trying to get the help that you need.
It's crazy how something seemingly so mundane like paperwork can have such a huge ripple effect across our lives.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that sludge is often a deliberate choice.
What?
It's a feature, not a bug. Companies and institutions, they design what's called choice architecture, which is a fancy way of saying they structure choices to influence our behavior.
Okay, so you're telling me this isn't just like bad design.
Sometimes, yeah.
This is intentional.
Often, yeah.
Wow, tell me more about that.
So think of it this way, right? You've got a company. They make it super easy to sign up for a service, but then incredibly difficult to cancel.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
That's sludge, right?
Yeah.
And it's often used to boost profits. These tactics, they have a name. They're called dark patterns. And they can really trick us into making decisions that we don't fully understand.
Yeah, it's like those sneaky subscription services that make it like almost impossible to unsubscribe. I've definitely fallen victim to that before. Okay, so sludge is this deliberate obstacle course designed to kind of manipulate us in a way. But how harmful can it really be?
The impact, it goes way beyond just frustration, right? This is a human cost.
Yeah.
It impacts our emotions, our dignity, and even our sense of self-worth. Imagine constantly battling these bureaucratic nightmares.
Yeah.
It can leave you feeling defeated,
Totally.
unimportant, even humiliated.
Yeah. And I would imagine it's even worse for folks already facing challenges like poverty or illness.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of cognitive scarcity comes in.
Okay.
So basically, it means that people dealing with poverty, illness, time constraints, they have limited mental bandwidth, right? They're already juggling so much that navigating sludge becomes this overwhelming burden.
It's like asking someone to run a marathon after they've already pulled an all-nighter.
Exactly.
They just don't have the capacity.
And the book actually mentioned a study about this.
Oh, yeah. About car repair costs.
Yeah, how it impacted people's cognitive performance. So researchers found that when presented with like a hypothetical $3,000 car repair bill, right, poorer individuals performed worse on cognitive tests, significantly worse.
Yeah.
Compared to those given a $300 bill.
Wow.
It highlights just how much even the thought of financial burden can drain these mental resources, leaving people less able to cope with other challenges, like sludge.
Yeah, that's such a powerful illustration of how sludge really disproportionately impacts those already struggling. So sludge isn't just this abstract concept, it has real-world consequences. To really kind of understand it and grasp the scope of this problem, let's look at some specific examples, right?
Absolutely.
Where do we see sludge in action?
One area where sludge is just rampant, and particularly concerning, is welfare programs. Right. These programs are designed to help those most in need, but often the very people who need that help the most face the biggest hurdles to accessing it.
Yeah, it's ironic. It's like offering a life raft, but making it like super difficult to actually climb aboard. The book compares Social Security to other welfare programs, right? To highlight the difference.
Exactly. Social Security is remarkably streamlined, almost sludge-free. You apply, you get approved, you receive your benefits.
Right.
Simple. Right.
Straightforward.
But other programs like SNFP, the Food Assistance Program, or TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, They're often bogged down with just unnecessary requirements in these really convoluted processes.
Yeah, I remember reading about those SNAP applications, and the questions they ask are just so bizarre sometimes.
What?
Like they ask about burial plots and stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, why is that relevant to someone's need for food assistance?
And TNF often requires multiple interviews, right?
Yeah.
Adding that extra layer of stress and burden
Mm.
for applicants already struggling to make ends meet.
It's a prime example of how sludge can create these unnecessary obstacles for the people who need help the most. And it's not just the big picture stuff, right? Even seemingly minor details can become these huge barriers. The book mentioned how the timing of CalFresh recertification interviews, which is California's SNAP program, could impact the failure rate.
Right, just the timing.
Yeah.
And the research shows that scheduling the interview just one day later in the month led to a 0.33% increase in the failure rate. It might seem small,
Yeah.
but when you're dealing with thousands of applicants, that translates to a significant number of people just losing essential benefits.
It's wild how even these seemingly small details in program design can have a huge impact. It makes me wonder how much of this is just bureaucratic inefficiency versus intentional sludge.
It's a mix, but one thing is for sure, when it comes to accessing essential services like healthcare, sludge can be a major roadblock. Take the Affordable Care Act.
Ooh, yeah. I remember that being a really complicated rollout. I mean, just navigating that healthcare marketplace website was confusing for a lot of people. It wasn't intuitive at all.
And while there were efforts to try and simplify enrollment, these efforts were sometimes countered by political decisions that actually increased sludge.
Oh, wow.
It highlights how political agendas can sometimes get in the way of creating user-friendly, accessible systems.
That's a perfect example of how sludge isn't just about bad design. It's often intertwined with all these complex political and economic factors. Okay, so we've seen how sludge impacts welfare programs and healthcare. What other areas are affected?
Well, occupational licensing is another prime example. You might be surprised to learn that in some states, becoming an interior designer takes longer than becoming a public kindergarten teacher.
What? No way, really?
Really?
That seems backwards. You'd think becoming a teacher would involve more hoops to jump through.
You would think so.
Yeah.
It's a perfect illustration of how licensing requirements, right, can create these unnecessary obstacles, particularly for those trying to enter certain professions.
Totally.
The book even mentions a state cosmetology commission website.
Okay.
16 different forms
16 forms to be a hairstylist?
to style hair.
That's ridiculous. It almost feels like they're trying to discourage people from pursuing certain careers.
And then there's the issue of student visas. The application process is so complex with its endless forms, website timeouts, confusing photo requirements. It can deter international students from coming to study here.
Yeah.
And it's a prime example of how sludge can not only impact individuals, but also hinder a country's ability to attract talent and investment. In fact, more than half of the students surveyed found the process difficult or complex.
That's a shame. It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot by making it so hard for people to come here and contribute.
And that brings us back to the idea of sludge hindering access to these fundamental rights. Think about the right to vote, for example.
Right. The book talked about how complicated voter registration processes, long lines at polling places, strict ID requirements can really disenfranchise a lot of Americans, especially in low-income communities.
Exactly. And the book explores some potential solutions, like using hospitals and emergency rooms as voter registration hubs
That's interesting.
to reach populations often excluded from the process.
I like that idea. That's a way to make voter registration more accessible and convenient, especially for people who might not have the time or resources to navigate the traditional methods.
Right. And then, of course, there's the ongoing debate about mail-in voting. While concerns about potential fraud exist, it's worth noting that mail-in voting can be seen as a way to reduce sludge and protect voting rights, right?
Yeah.
It makes voting more accessible for people who might face challenges getting to the polls. People with disabilities, people living in rural areas.
This deep dive is really making me rethink, how these seemingly mundane bureaucratic processes can have such a profound impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. Sludge is more pervasive and consequential than most people realize.
Yeah.
But, there's good news.
Oh, is
They're
there?
not powerless against it.
Okay, there's hope. We don't have to just accept this as the status quo.
No, not at all. The book offers practical solutions for fighting back, and one of the most compelling ideas is something called the sludge audit.
Okay, a sludge audit.
Yes.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
It involves systematically identifying and eliminating unnecessary burdens in any process. The goal isn't to eliminate all friction, because some friction is necessary for accountability, preventing errors, but it's about finding that sweet spot where the process is both efficient and effective.
So it's about streamlining things without sacrificing integrity or accuracy.
Exactly.
I like it.
And what's interesting is that the COVID-19 pandemic actually provided a real-world example of how sludge reduction can happen on a large scale.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The book talks about how the pandemic kind of inadvertently led to a war on sludge because governments had to streamline those processes to make sure people got essential services and benefits.
Precisely. Suddenly, those long wait times and mountains of paperwork became unacceptable when people desperately needed health care or unemployment benefits or food assistance.
Yeah, it's like the old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like in this case, the pandemic really forced us to confront the real consequences of sludge and find ways to get rid of it. What were some of the specific changes that were made during that time?
Well, for one, many states waived the requirement for in-person interviews for S&AP benefits.
Oh, okay.
This not only reduced the burden on applicants, but also allowed those caseworkers to process applications more quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. It cuts out travel time, scheduling conflicts, and all those logistical hurdles that can prevent people from getting the benefits they need.
Exactly. And then there's the rapid adoption of telehealth services. The pandemic forced healthcare providers to embrace virtual appointments, and that made it easier for people to access care, especially those in rural areas or with mobility issues.
It's a great example of how technology can be used to reduce sludge. It's kind of ironic that it took a global pandemic to push us towards these more efficient and accessible systems.
It is ironic, isn't it? It makes you wonder, if we can reduce sludge in a crisis, why can't we do it all the time?
That's the million-dollar question. So what's the answer? What can we do to keep this momentum going even after the pandemic is over?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. The more we understand sludge and its impact, the more we can demand better. It's about shifting from a culture of acceptance to a culture of questioning.
Okay, so it's not just about government action. It's about all of us becoming more mindful of sludge in our own lives and advocating for change. But what does that look like in practice? I mean, how can I as an individual fight back against something as big and as entrenched as bureaucracy?
You'd be surprised, even small acts of resistance can make a difference the next time you encounter a needlessly complicated process. Ask yourself, is this really necessary? If not, speak up, contact your elected officials, file complaints, or just share your experience with others.
That's a good point. Sometimes just voicing your frustration can help raise awareness and put pressure on these institutions to change. And knowing about sludge, even if you can't always defeat, it can at least help you navigate it more effectively, right?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. Understanding the concept of sludge can make you a savvier consumer, a more informed citizen, and a more empowered individual. It can help you spot those dark patterns, advocate for simpler solutions, and avoid getting bogged down in all that unnecessary bureaucracy.
So this deep dive isn't just about complaining about paperwork. It's about equipping our listeners with the tools to navigate the world more effectively.
Exactly. It's about understanding the systems we interact with and finding ways to make them work better for everyone.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've defined sludge, explored its impact, looked at some real-world examples, and even discussed ways to fight back. What's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember from all of this?
That sludge is not inevitable. It's a problem we can address both individually and collectively. By raising awareness, advocating for change, and demanding better, we can create a world with less sludge and more flow.
That's a great message to end on, but before we wrap up completely, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, this idea that sludge can be used to manipulate us.
Yeah.
Can you give us some specific examples of how companies use sludge for their own benefit?
Sure. Think about those free trials that automatically convert into paid subscriptions unless you cancel within a very specific time frame.
Oh, yeah.
That's a classic sludge tactic.
Yeah.
Companies know that many people will simply forget to cancel, and they profit from that inertia.
Oh, yeah. I've totally fallen for that one before. It's so frustrating. What else?
Another common tactic is burying important information deep within lengthy terms and conditions agreements. Companies bet that most people won't bother to read the fine print, so they can sneak in clauses that benefit them, even if they're not in the best interest of the consumer.
It's like those sneaky airline baggage fees that magically appear after you've already booked your flight, and you're like stuck because you've already invested time and money.
Exactly. And then there are those websites that make it incredibly difficult to unsubscribe from email lists or delete your account.
Oh, yeah.
They'll require you to jump through multiple hoops, hoping you'll just give up out of frustration. A classic example of sludge as a barrier to exit.
So it's not just about making things difficult to start, it's also about making them difficult to stop. That's so sneaky.
It is sneaky, but by recognizing these tactics, we can become more discerning consumers and avoid falling prey to them. It's about being aware of the power dynamics at play and demanding transparency and fairness from the companies we interact with.
This conversation has definitely made me more aware of all the subtle ways that sludge operates in our lives. I feel like I'm going to be looking for it everywhere now.
And that's a good thing. The more aware we are, the more empowered we are to fight back. Remember, sludge thrives in the shadows by shining a light on it. We can start to dismantle it.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Take a moment to think about your own experiences with sludge. Where have you encountered it in your life? What can you do, even in small ways, to navigate it more effectively or even fight back against it?
Remember, even small acts of resistance can make a difference by speaking up, advocating for change, and demanding better. We can create a world with less sludge and more flow.
Okay, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. We hope this episode has given you a new perspective on the world around you and inspired you to become a sludge warrior in your own right. Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious. You know, as we've been talking about sludge and how companies manipulate it, it makes me think back to our deep dive on behavioral economics a while back.
Yeah, that's a great connection.
It really is.
Behavioral economics is so key to understanding how sludge is created and how it affects us.
Right? Like that whole concept of choice architecture we discussed earlier. It's crazy how the way choices are presented can really influence our decisions even when we think we're being completely rational.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of nudges comes in.
Right. Nudges.
Remember, nudge is any aspect of the choice architecture that subtly guides our behavior without actually forbidding any options or significantly changing economic incentives.
Okay.
So think of it like this. Placing fruit at eye level in a grocery store, that's a nudge.
Okay.
Banning junk food outright, that's not a nudge.
Okay. Yeah, it's coming back to me now. But how do nudges relate to sludge? Are they the same thing?
They're related, but not the same. Nudges can be used for good or for bad, right? To either reduce or increase sludge.
Okay.
So a good nudge streamlines processes, making things easier, more intuitive.
Right.
A bad nudge does the opposite. It adds unnecessary complexity, frustration.
So a good nudge kind of helps us glide through the process, while a bad nudge throws us right into the sludge pit.
Precisely. And this is where ethical considerations come in. Like any tool, nudges can be used for good or for evil.
Right.
So a company might use nudges to trick customers into buying something they don't need.
Yeah.
Or a government might use nudges to encourage people to save for retirement or make healthier choices.
So it all comes down to intent and how these nudges are designed. It sounds like sludge often goes hand in hand with these more manipulative nudges.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Sludge can be a way to discourage people from taking actions that they have every right to take. For example, have you ever tried to cancel a subscription or file a complaint only to find that process incredibly complicated and frustrating?
Oh, all the time.
Right. It's like they're hoping you'll just give up and go away.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a form of passive-aggressive manipulation.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so crucial to be aware of these tactics. Knowing about sludge and these nudges, it can really empower you as a consumer, as a citizen, as an individual.
Absolutely. So this deep dive isn't just about venting about bureaucracy. It's about giving our listeners the tools to really navigate the world more effectively.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah?
Knowledge is power, and understanding these concepts can truly make a difference in your life.
100%. Okay, so before we wrap things up for today, I want to kind of circle back to one of the most interesting points from the book, the idea that the COVID-19 pandemic, with all its devastation, actually taught us some valuable lessons about sludge reduction.
Yeah, it's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is.
The pandemic, it forced governments and institutions to really confront the very real consequences of sludge, in some ways for the first time.
Right. Suddenly, those long wait times and mountains of paperwork, they just weren't acceptable when people's lives were on the line.
Exactly. And we saw some remarkable examples of how quickly processes could be streamlined, barriers could be removed, when the sense of urgency was high.
Yeah.
Like the widespread adoption of telehealth services or waiving those in-person interview requirements for benefits.
It's amazing how quickly things can change when the will is there. Which kind of begs the question, if we could reduce sludge during a crisis, why not all the time?
That's the challenge before us now. How do we maintain this momentum this realization that things don't have to be so difficult.
Yeah. What is the answer? How do we keep it going?
I think a big part of the answer lies in changing our mindset.
Okay.
We need to shift from a culture of accepting unnecessary complexity to a culture of questioning it.
Mm.
Stop seeing sludge as just this inevitable part of life and start demanding better, simpler, more human-centered processes.
You know, it's like that quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world." Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
Oh, I love that. And it's so true. Every time we question an unnecessary burden, advocate for a simpler solution, or just share our experiences with others, we're chipping away at the sludge that bogs us down.
So let's all commit to becoming sludge warriors in our own way.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's demand better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of sludge. We hope this episode has given you a new lens through which to view the world around you and maybe inspired you to take action against the sludge in your own life.
Remember, awareness is the first step to change, and even those small acts of resistance can make a difference.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everybody. Until next time, stay curious.